início ao nosso último painel do dia, Mercado Café CEOs. O excedente atual é suficientemente grande para satisfazer as necessidades do mercado? Para isso, convido ao palco o Teddy Esteve, Diretor-Geral da Ecom, Agroindustrial Corp. Convido também Ben Clarkson, diretor global da Plataforma de Café da Dreyfus Company. Trishul Mandana, diretor-geral de Café Volcafé. E para mediar o painel, Carlos Augusto, presidente da Cooxupé, nossa cafeteria oficial do evento.
Boa tarde a todas, a todos. É um prazer estar aqui. Primeiramente, eu gostaria aqui de parabenizar e agradecer por nossa presença na pessoa do Mauro Samarco, a todos os organizadores que o 14º Seminário de Café nos traz e oferece essa oportunidade de estarmos aqui. Eu quero aqui cumprimentar também os nossos palestrantes. Eu falo que estou me referindo a Teddy Esteve, a Trishul Mandana e Ben Clarkson, respectivamente, diretor-geral da Plataforma Global da Dreyfus Company. Depois temos o trecho aqui com o diretor da Volcafé, diretor-geral, e também o nosso presidente, o nosso diretor-geral da Ecom, o nosso Teddy Esteve. Bem, é um grande prazer estarmos aqui neste painel, neste evento, participando e compartilhando informações relevantes para o mercado, para a produção e o consumo do nosso café ao mundo. Eu sou Carlos Augusto Rodrigues de Melo, sou produtor rural, estou na 5ª geração da minha família, estou localizado, minha propriedade na região do sul de Minas Gerais, mais precisamente Cabo Verde, e faço parte da Cooxupé, Cooperativa dos Cafeicultores em Guaxupé, há 41 anos, como participante na direção dos conselhos fiscais e conselho de administração. E também, atualmente, sou presidente da Cooxupé, uma organização que congrega mais de 19 mil associados, sendo que 94% desses associados, ela é constituída por produtores pequenos, microprodutores e produtores de renda familiar. Eu tenho um quadro de colaboradores de 2.600 colaboradores e exportamos café para mais de 50 países. Eu tenho a honra aqui de ser mediador desse painel, um painel que vamos falar sobre mercado. E gostaria de destacar aqui a questão dos estoques. A pergunta que se faz é o seguinte: nossos estoques são suficientemente grandes para atender à demanda do mercado? Para tanto, nós estamos aqui com 3 especialistas, 3 autoridades do mercado para conversarmos, bater um papo. E aqui nós vamos fazer algumas perguntas. O formato deste painel que nós idealizamos foi nesse sentido. Nós vamos fazer as perguntas e eles responderão. Mais uma vez, eu quero aqui desejar as boas-vindas, agradecer pela participação de vocês aqui neste painel. Antes, porém, eu gostaria aqui de fazer um preâmbulo, uma contextualização do painel para que um melhor entendimento de todos, né? A cafeicultura é muito desafiadora para os produtores e também para aqueles responsáveis por levar nosso café mundo afora. A nossa produção está constantemente susceptível às intempéries do clima. A safra do Arábica do Brasil passou por 3 anos de produções baixas. Esse ano, esperamos uma safra muito parecida com a de 2023. Isto, no caso Brasil, e mais precisamente na área da Cooxupé. Eu queria dizer que a Cooxupé participa em mais de 300 municípios, e dentre eles nas regiões do sul de Minas, Cerrado Mineiro, região das Matas de Minas e também na média mogiana paulista. Também já temos relatos que a Colômbia se prepara para uma tentativa de recuperação na produção do Arábica, mas ainda com muitos problemas na produção. Por sua vez, também o Vietnã enfrenta problemas de seca. A questão é, temos uma oferta favorável para suprir esse mercado? Em contrapartida a tudo isso, o mercado e os consumidores globais estão cada vez mais exigentes, mais engajados para consumir um café de qualidade e, sobretudo, com procedência, respeitando os pilares sustentáveis, social, ambiental e econômico. Produzimos café para o mundo e para um novo consumidor cada vez mais exigente, engajado com as boas práticas e que tem suas decisões pautadas na sustentabilidade, ESG. Eu tenho certeza que as apresentações deste painel serão muito relevantes para todos nós aqui presentes. E, para entendimento, eu gostaria de dividir as perguntas aqui em 5 temas. O primeiro, oferta e demanda. Depois nós vamos passar pela qualidade e os blends, o mercado e finanças, a logística no Brasil e a sustentabilidade com as mudanças climáticas. Para iniciarmos o painel, eu quero convidar aqui a todos para um bate-papo, né, como já disse, com os nossos painelistas. E eu vou iniciar aqui pelo item da oferta e demanda. E a pergunta que se faz é o seguinte: o mercado global de café é excedentário ou deficitário? Por que é que os mercados do Arábica e Robusta subiram desde outubro de 2023? É provável que a produção aumente o suficiente para criar estoques, tanto nos países consumidores como nos países produtores? Isso trará estabilidade a longo prazo no mercado e incentivará o consumo? Essa é a pergunta que eu deixo aqui e fique à vontade para respondê-la.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us on the panel, and thank you for everyone coming to listen. So maybe what I'll do is address the first 2 questions on this this first section. So is the market, the most loaded question, is the market in a surplus or deficit? And if we go back a slide, which we don't need to, but what is interesting is that the original title for this panel was about the surplus, and is the surplus enough to satisfy global demand? I think the simple answer is that we would see the market in a small deficit. And the second question here is why have both markets, Arabica and Robusta, rallied since October? The answer that we would give here, I would give, is that really this has been initiated from the Robusta side. Robusta in the previous few years as we've seen production losses, particularly in Vietnam. We saw some production losses last year in Indonesia. So both of the major Asia Robusta producers have underperformed, and then some very good demand for Robustas initiated by price, inflation, cost of living, and all of this created a Robusta deficit that allowed the market to move higher in October 2023 when it became apparent that perhaps Vietnam didn't have as much coffee as people thought, and this is where we got to today.
Let me continue with that. First of all,
Obrigado.
thank you very much for having me on the panel. I appreciate being here. It's always very nice being back in Brazil, so thank you for that. I'll just pick up on Ben. I think, the story goes back probably to the middle of last year, or maybe a little bit earlier, where we think that the global roaster, so not pointing out at any particular roaster, but let's say the global roaster, made some very important decisions, and that decision was to deal with the current inflationary, recessionary environment, where he then decided that in order to bring a product to the consumer that was of more value, that he would begin to use more Robustas. It doesn't mean he necessarily deteriorated his blend, but what he did was he began to use more Robustas either because he was putting out products on the shelf that had more Robusta, or effectively incorporating more Robusta in his blend. The challenge was that it wasn't just one roaster that was doing it. It was pretty much across the board that a lot of roasters began to take advantage of what they thought was a cheaper product. And that created obviously a much higher demand for Robustas in general. And as Ben said, it coincided with the time that production, particularly in Vietnam, that I think people realized much later was much smaller than expected. And you say, why was it smaller? The big phenomenon we've seen in Vietnam is that there are alternative crops, and I talk specifically about fruit crops. Durian is a very lucrative crop that's being grown in Vietnam for export to China. So what we have actually seen is durian in certain places has begun to replace Robusta coffee as a far more lucrative crop for the producer. And that has then meant that the amount of Robusta production in Vietnam has sort of declined. And it's coincided with the time that global Robusta demand increased. I think the world as a whole was very slow to pick up on that. And I think we are seeing those consequences play through even to today. So effectively what's happened really since the Swiss Coffee Dinner, which was an event back in September 2023, people were talking a very large surplus, and the reality there is that there is in fact a surplus on Arabicas, and then the question is, what is the size of that surplus? I think there is no secret that there is quite a wide variation between different people in the trade on the size of the global Arabica crop, particularly related to Brazil. For those of us who had maybe slightly smaller Arabica crops, it has meant that the quantity of Arabica to fill this gap by Robusta has not been sufficient. So what has actually happened over the last several months is Robusta has been increasing in consumption. There's not enough Robusta to meet the needs of the roaster, and this has basically pushed Robusta price up. And ultimately, if there's not a major surplus of Arabica, it's very difficult to fix the current issue. In our view, the global Robusta deficit is equal to the Arabica surplus that's out there globally, and the world is slowly fixing the problem. I think for the first time in my career, we are seeing the price of Robusta as the world grapples with this problem, actually pushing up Arabica price. And I don't think the problem has completely resolved it, and that's what's going on.
Very well. My turn to thank you for coming today and for inviting me to this panel. I'm very happy to be here. If you remember October of last year, as Trishul was saying, Basel Convention, everybody was as bearish as you can be. Everybody thought there was too much coffee in the world. And we were coming out of a year when basically demand was very poor. Demand was very poor because every roaster in the world was using the stocks they had built up over the last year or so, or the post-COVID days, where they had built up handsome stocks, and then the market inverted, and then the interest rates went up. So basically the roasters were using all their inventory, and the traders, they said, well, demand really is low. But actually it wasn't the demand that was low, the consumption that was low. It was just the reaction to the frost that we had had 2-3 years before. So if you remember Basel, everybody was bearish. The same way that today everybody is bullish. So, you know, the trade is like a herd where, you know, we all go in one direction. Obviously in Basel we were all wrong. I'm the eternal bull and they got me bearish. I don't know how they did it, you know. So today, if you look at the divergence between Robusta and Arabica, obviously there is a very big deficit of Robusta and there is a surplus of Arabica. And the one who's going to make that shift, in my opinion, is the Brazilian consumer. Because today, the Brazilian blend that you are drinking every day, which was mainly Conilons last year, this year will have a lot more Arabica. So you will liberate a lot of Conilon for export or for inventory or for whatever, but there will be that excess deficit will be fixed in Brazil. The problem number 2, obviously, is who's going to drink those Conilons? But that's a problem for our next question. So back to you, Ben.
Obrigado. Nós vamos ter uma segunda pergunta nesse tema, que é: quão vazio estão os canais de abastecimento de café dos comerciantes aos torrefadores, vendedores e consumidores finais? Poderá o setor conviver com o atual ambiente de baixos estoques no futuro? No futuro. Como as projeções de taxas de juros mudarão essa situação? Está claro?
You want me to start this time? Okay. Well, I will start. You know, if you go a year ago, that pipeline was full, completely full. But then the CFOs of all the companies in the world, from the roasters to the traders, everybody said, don't carry coffee because it's very expensive to carry. It's inverted. The interest rates are high. So carry as little as you can. So that pipeline, from being very comfortable, became very uncomfortable. So if you ask me today, you know, the pipeline is, I would say, at not the minimum, but it's, let's say, close to the minimum of what it should be. Obviously, we have the Brazilian winter ahead, so people are taking their precautions. They don't want to be completely naked ahead of such an event. You know, they want to have a little bit of cover. But I would say that the coverage is obviously much, much lower than a year ago. And is it dangerous? In some cases it is. You know, we've had to ship coffee by plane this year sometimes, so for small people, but still it tells you that Some people are playing it very close. And how will interest rates play? You know, I think interest rates are too low. I think America is still booming. And I believe that they will never do it, but they need to raise interest rates. Otherwise, they will continue to hire everybody in Central America. You know, everybody's crossing. The politicians say they don't want them, but they all get a job the next day. So America is too hot. If you ask me, they need to raise interest rates, but that will be after the elections. We need a recession, in other words.
I would concur. I mean, I think the pipeline, which was extremely full post-COVID, and I think most of you can remember that it wasn't that long ago that that the world had extreme freight problems, where freight basically rocketed up to unseen sort of levels over $10,000 a container. And then the roaster, what he did at that particular point, he started building a pipeline to deal with freight issues. What's happened since is that post-COVID, we've seen demand come off. Demand has been soft. The roaster has been looking at his level of inventory. The CFOs at the roasting companies have been asking some very hard questions. He's reduced inventory enormously. And the trade, at the same time, has done what is efficient. For the first time in my 32 career, I have not seen very high interest rates and inverted markets at the same time. And this forces the trade naturally to be extremely efficient. It also coincides at a time where the roaster is looking at very sort of, looking at an inverted market and high prices and not basically buying forward strings of coffee. He's been living hand to mouth. The trade isn't carrying any coffee because of high interest rates and inverted markets. And as a result of that, the pipeline has gone practically empty. So in my mind today, where the roaster used to always have the comfort of some stocks, that comfort has gone away. And you see that in many different ways. Teddy's example of coffee being flown by aeroplane to small roasters. Or if you look at what's been happening in terms of a lot of the roasters, whether it's local or international, you know, suddenly coming and buying coffee for delivery in the next 1 or 2 weeks. If you look at where he's been buying futures, normally he would be buying futures in the back months, but he's now buying futures in the first month. So I think, you know, the amount of stocks that are out there, the market can't deal with the shock at the moment. And it's quite a interesting, challenging environment, both I think for the trade and as well as for the industry at the moment.
So I think the first thing here is just to make a distinction between the pipeline that I feel I understand and the pipeline that I feel that is more difficult for us in our roles to distinguish and understand. So the first thing is we really operate in, as our businesses, and I would speak for my colleagues here, probably the same, we really operate in producing countries. We have warehouses, port stocks, and then we ship out to our customers. And really the visible coffee that we can see, the visible stocks that we can see typically will be in our warehouses and the warehouses in the producing countries, and then to the bonded ports. And so typically we would call these visible stocks. And then what is very difficult, and I think this question is interesting, because what's very difficult is then what happens after the bonded ports in, say, Western Europe and to the shelf of the supermarket and through the roaster's assets. And at my company, we would call these invisible stocks, which is not a very original term. So I think what we see in the visible stocks, so the stocks that I have confidence here talking about, so the stocks in the bonded ports in say, Europe, US, they are very low. In very crude numbers, European stocks in the last 18 months are roughly half what they were 18 months ago. So today they are roughly half what they were 18 months ago. Anecdotally, I would completely agree with what Trishul and Teddy have said. We at Dreyfus are seeing much more interest in coffee next week, next month, than we And normally this time of year we would be selling shipment spreads, so for 6 months. So whilst that is not hard evidence, it suggests to me that the invisible part of the pipeline is quite empty. Can we live with low coverage? Low coverage typically brings volatility. We are seeing volatility in price, in basis, so that's the physical coffee, and we're seeing volatility in the future spreads. This is because of low stocks. So can we live with this? I would say to settle our business down, settle these markets down, we need more stocks. And on interest rate projections, well, I'm glad Teddy's here. I'll remortgage my house quickly. How do interest rate projections change all this? I think if there's not enough coffee, interest rate projections don't change very much at all. I think when you get into the minutiae of how to price a market and carry interest rate projections are important, but when you don't really have enough coffee and you're in inverses, it's not the first consideration unless you have extraordinary interest rate shifts.
Bem, podemos dizer que, pelo consenso, que nós temos baixos estoques nesse momento. Confirmam? É isso? Em linhas gerais. Eu acho que é isso, né? Nós temos uma última pergunta aqui, nesse tema de oferta e demanda ainda. Nós gostaríamos que vocês se pontuassem. O que é necessário para que essa oferta seja estimulada para além do Brasil? Especificamente, eu estou me referindo ao Sudeste Asiático e à África. Existe atualmente algum incentivo suficiente para que os produtores continuem a investir, neste momento de baixo estoque, em tecnologias práticas agrícolas e desenvolvimento de variedades a resistente? Exemplo, a questão climática. Ted? Pode?
Okay.
Fica à vontade.
Okay, here we go. Obviously, current prices are a blessing for the farmers. So they say that the best cure for deficits is high prices. Fantastic, we have high prices, we have to expect production to grow around the world. Unfortunately, we've had nice prices for the last few years and in Arabica, and production is not growing. It's not growing because to grow Arabica, you know, I'm an Arabica farmer, so I can tell you, it's not as easy as Robusta. And basically, in Latin America, there's no more labor. So, and plus, the cost of labor has easily doubled over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So that makes coffee production very difficult. So when you extrapolate what's going on today, you say the only countries that can survive are the ones who mechanize coffee, which is Brazil, and who are very efficient. Like, you know, the Vietnamese people are the most hardworking farmers in the world. You really need to be very hardworking to get the profitability, okay? And I'm going to throw out a little, little thing to wake you up. Is 100 years ago, 100% of the vanilla consumed in the world was natural. Today, it's maybe 1%. So in 100 years, how much of the coffee we consume will be a natural coffee? Just, you can answer in the cocktails tonight.
Shall I? No.
I think the answer to this question is far more complicated. There are certainly, if you look at Central America, I agree with Teddy, the cost of labor is expensive. There's a lot of migration that's been going across the border. I think if you had asked us this question, let's say 10 years ago, if you had a price in excess of $2, would you see an increased production response all across the world? I think all of us would have said, yes, production is going to grow all across the world. I think the fact of the matter is that production certainly hasn't grown in Central America. And you say, why? Cost of labor, the fact that there's migration, the farmer basically doesn't have the ability to lock in a second year's price. So, he basically reacts. He doesn't really immediately go and produce more coffee. He's has been basically very cautious. You look at places like Papua New Guinea, parts of Africa, the ag extension services. Brazil has very good support. The farmer has a lot of support for ag extension services. In a lot of these countries, the farmers like the prices, but they don't really have access to the seedlings, the ability to grow coffee on existing land and increase that. So, there are different reasons that these countries actually aren't adding to production. Then, of course, you have Brazil, which is fantastic. It's basically very efficient. And by our estimates, if you basically look at the next 10, 15 years, we think Brazil will basically supply between 75 to 80% of what the world needs. I forgot about Vietnam. Vietnam basically actually has found alternative crops which are far more lucrative to the farmer. So that's the reason production, in fact, is not going up, it's going down. So here we have a problem, which is Brazil, which is already extremely efficient, is the one country that can react very quickly to a price incentive. And it does, and it will continue to, in my opinion. And that's why I say I think the world's new supply, 70 to 80% of the world's new supply will come from Brazil. I will say something, though. I think we need to be very frightened about that. It's not necessarily a good thing. And the reason we say that, we'll talk about maybe on another slide. For those of you who have been looking at what happens when the world begins to rely on one producer or two producers, and for those of you who have looked at cocoa, there are some lessons to learn. But we will basically go to that in a subsequent slide. Okay?
Obrigado, Trish. Mais ou menos isso. Vamos lá.
Yeah. I don't have too much to add here. I think the crude answer here is price. What is fascinating is if you compare the rally that we've had in the last, let's say, 18 months, both on the differentials, the basis, and also the flat price, and you look at, say, the 2010, 2011 rally, as my two colleagues here have said, I think what's been very disappointing is that the milds producer, and it's interesting that the milds isn't on here, but the milds producer, let's say, from Mexico to Peru, so that group of people is actually, those crops are down over the last 5 years, despite the rally and the high price, maybe 10% for lots of different reasons. So I think that's very disappointing. Ultimately, if we as an industry, we as a business, we as a group of people continue to focus on price, that gravitates towards the most efficient producer who can sell at the cheapest price, and ultimately today that is Brazil. The cost of production for the milds producer today, whilst profitable, is 25, 30, 40% higher than Brazil. So we are increasingly, as Trishul has just said, we're increasingly benefiting Brazil. So yes, there is enough incentive. We haven't talked about weather. Both the two big producers in the world, Brazil and Vietnam, have struggled to meet potential because of weather. But ultimately, I believe price over time, there is enough of an incentive for more coffee.
Obrigado. Bem, agora nós vamos bater outro tema e nós vamos trabalhar aqui na questão da qualidade e dos blends. E a pergunta que ora se faz é: quais são os requisitos de qualidade esperados para os próximos 5 a 10 anos? As misturas entre arábicas e robusta serão definidas apenas com base em preços? Trush?
Look, I think what we're seeing in the marketplace today is telling us a pretty clear story. Why is Robusta at the price where it is today? Is because the roaster, the industry decided very much that they needed to take costs down. And what they basically did was they shifted blends, but I think the challenge is, whilst they shifted blends, because the market was inverted, maybe they didn't actually buy both the differentials and the price. And as they've then basically tried to catch up with that, price has had an enormous rally, and the basis of the differential has remained very, very strong. I think rather sadly, when you also then look at what's happening with Central America and the miles, we have quite a bizarre sort of a situation at the minute, which is that, you have Robusta coffee that, because of the shift in demand, we saw briefly Vietnam trading at a premium to Colombia, which I've never seen in my lifetime. And the fact of the matter ultimately is the pursuit of price, I think, has been a primary. When I say price, I mean the cheapest coffee has been what has driven a lot of industry decisions. So if you look at the next 5 to 10 years, I think the industry have to make some very clear choices. Are they going to make all their determinations on just using price as the relevant metric? Or are they actually going to say, look, they have a story to tell, that they need to protect the long-term sanctity of their available supply? And what I would say to the industry as a whole, there are some very strong lessons to be learned from what has happened in cocoa. The pursuit of the cheapest cost option, whether it is Arabica, Robusta, or Brazil for that matter, eventually has a consequence. And that consequence is, if there's a weather event, then clearly I think the market as a whole has a very extreme problem. I find it quite mystifying, because you would think that, if a roaster is selling coffee and there's stories to tell around coffee, that you would like to have Guatemala, you'd like to have Brazil, you'd like to have a whole complex series of coffees available. And also to protect your supply chain, that you'd like to have all these producers in business. We are not seeing that today. And that's, I think, something that we collectively really need to be very worried about. What we're seeing is the industry is reacting to soft demand numbers, and is reacting to it by going to the cheapest possible source of supply. Last year it was Robustas. This year maybe it goes back to Arabicas that are cheaper than Robustas. But a lot of decisions are being made on the basis of price. And I don't believe that's good for our industry in the long term. And it's not good for the way in which we can manage our supply chain risk in the long term. So my answer is, I think they would basically make the answers purely based on price. And I'm also saying that's not good.
Fica à vontade.
Let me just pick up on that, because I think that if we go back 4 or 5 years, the conversation was much more. We started using the phrase premiumization. So what is premiumization? Premiumization was, as the way I understand it, increasingly our customers, the consumer, was happy to spend more money on a better coffee. And we generally saw that the wash coffees, if you walk down a high street in a big city, you saw a lot more artisan coffee shops selling extremely good coffee. So I would say that's not necessarily about price. That was the consumer looking for quality. I would say today it is about price. Now, why is it about price? Because prices are extremely high. So the answer to this question for me is, depends on the absolute price. It depends on the health of the global consumer. It depends on GDP. Have you got a job? And I think that is really, really the answer. We've said, my colleagues have said a couple of times here about Robusta deficits, Arabica surpluses. I think what's interesting today is, if you look at a Vietnam price, the biggest exporter of Robusta in the world, is trading at, let's say, 5% premium to a Brazil Group 1, roughly. Well, let's call it the same price. So we've never seen that. So really the answer to these questions also is who in the room or who in the world is saying, okay, look, these Vietnams are pretty expensive. I can actually encourage my consumer with a better quality, typically, and a better quality coffee. And is that happening or is it not happening? One of the issues is that a lot of the growth in consumption today is happening in Asia. Asia typically uses a much heavier Robusta blend. So the other side of the argument is, hey, look, yes, the price of Vietnam's is very expensive, but you've got an Asian consumer, and particularly Southeast Asia, who's hooked on soluble coffee, hooked on Robustas. So that would be the counter argument. But certainly prices for Robustas are very expensive indeed relative to some exceptionally good Arabicas.
I will complement the comments of my colleagues, with who I agree, by saying that today we are seeing a boom in the soluble industry. We are seeing new plants pop up everywhere. We are seeing consumption of instant coffee and the consumption of coffee as an ingredient increase. And all those plants use Robusta. And another part of the industry which is growing tremendously is the ready-to-drink. In the United States, 30% of the sales in US dollars of coffee is ready-to-drink. US dollars, not volume. And they use instant coffee. So basically there's a new category, the instant coffee is growing. And like in cocoa, the market is made at the margins. There's always somebody short at the top that needs to be, I would say that today the people who are paying 1,000 over is because they're short, they have to deliver it to somebody. But is the market going to pay 1,000 over for the next year? That I don't know. Obviously, there's a lot of people short, they have to pay up, and that's why there's this huge premium. The premium will probably continue, but I expect it to go down a little bit. But so those are the two factors which I think are leading to these increased usage of Robusta, which is the ready-to-drink industry with the boom of the soluble industry, as some people might agree with.
Só para complementar, o que dentro desse tema, o que levou os preços do Robusta do Vietnã, já foi respondido em parte, mais elevados do que os preços do Excelso da Colômbia? Qual é esse impacto provável que possa ter?
Okay, I would say that the Vietnamese crop last year, there was a lot of defaults, not this year that just finished. Last year there was a lot of defaults, and a lot of the Vietnamese exporters said, don't worry, I'll ship next year. And this year, again, they say, don't worry, I'll ship next year. The problem is they oversold, and that creates a lot of shorts. And I think what has driven the Robusta prices higher in Vietnam is the shorts who sold the contract and they need to deliver. And those shorts could have been the exporters who passed the buck to the international trade by saying, hey, guess what, I don't have it, figure it out yourself. So what has created those high prices, I think, is the shorts. The people sold Robusta thinking their suppliers would deliver, and they didn't deliver. So they had to pay up. But I welcome another opinion.
I think the answer is a bit of both. Clearly, we have had a situation where trade has been short Vietnam Robusta. And he's been struggling with defaults, and when he's basically had to rebuy the coffee, the basis has been very strong. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that, obviously a number of roasters who made the decision to switch into Robusta, let's say 12, 18 months ago, in bigger size, made the decision to switch, did all the blend testing, made the choice, and then didn't actually end up buying the differential of the coffee. And which has meant that if you looked over the last several months, we have seen roasters also participating at some very high prices on Vietnam. And you say, okay, why is that actually happening? Why don't they buy Brazil Conlons instead, which are significantly better value? And the answer lies in many different things. If you have sustainability chains set up in Vietnam, you can't suddenly switch to Brazil from one day to the next. If you want glyphosate-free coffee and you have your glyphosate-free chains in Vietnam, you can't switch immediately to Brazil and expect to source glyphosate-free in a 2 or 3 month period. You've got to set up those supply chains. There are issues that if you're producing, for example, soluble coffee for use in Asia, there's a very high tax on coffee that isn't coming from Asia. So that also basically prevents a switch. Today, the world's grappling with, in my history, I've never seen Vietnam trading at a price higher than Colombia. It seems somewhat untenable. But what has surprised me the most is that the roaster who has, let's say, incorporated greater Robusta into his blend, which in my mind is a deterioration of the blend, tells us that it's equally difficult to upgrade to a better product, because he has to go through a whole series of taste tests to improve the product. And so from that sort of perspective, he is not making that shift that easily. And I think the job of the market at this particular point, very perversely, is to literally take maybe Robusta prices to a value where he forces the roaster into basically buying more Arabicas, and that begins to resolve the problem. In short, the Robusta deficit needs to be fixed by the Arabica surplus, and I think that is something that is not done yet, will occur eventually, and when that happens, I think you'll sort of see Vietnam Robusta go back to more normal value, but we're not seeing that just yet. Enough size it.
I will be quick because the risk of repeating myself, but if I just focus on the Colombia side, which we haven't done yet, I think we probably forget that Colombia's were 2-3 years ago were trading, if I get this right, 70 cents premium to the Arabica market, 70 to 80 cents premium at some point to the Arabica market. At the same time, the Arabica market was, let's say, twice the value of the Robusta market. I'm talking about the futures market. So Colombians were significant premiums to Robusta. And the underlying current at the time was one of, we were sort of post-COVID, the consumer was looking for cheaper things, and so we moved out of Colombian demand very crudely into Vietnam demand. I'm not sure it's one for one, but certainly there was a shift along the quality. I don't particularly disagree with the impacts that we've talked around already. As I said 5 minutes ago, the likely impact, we know what's going to happen. There's going to be a shift back. It doesn't need to be a very big shift to rebalance supply and demand between the two coffees. The debate really is how quickly is that going to happen? Is it how much is happening today? And how long does it take?
Podemos dizer que hoje, tanto Robusta quanto Arábica, nós estamos com problema no mundo. E você diz, Trish, que o Robusta pode ser suprido por uma oferta de Arábica. É isto, né? Mas hoje, pelo que visto, nós estamos com um problema de estoque de uma ordem geral. E além do que, vejo que essa relação de preço, continuamos ainda, o Brasil, mais favorável do que esses países já citados aqui por vocês para equalizar essa questão de oferta do mercado?
This is a very interesting question because, it goes back again to October, so September, October. I think the world just genuinely believed that there was a very significant global surplus. I think some of us looked at that and had the view that what the world had was an Arabica surplus and a Robusta deficit. And the size of the Arabica surplus was more or less the same size as the Robusta deficit. So you needed to have a shift between those two coffees. I think other people in the trade have had the view that there is in fact a global surplus. For me, the way the market has traded, I mean, if it's a 1 month or a 2 month thing, it's, tells you a story. But if you have practically 9 months where we have really struggled to come under $2, and we've seen the price of Robusta go to a value we've not seen in history, with the price of the basis of the coffee, the differential is Vietnam trading literally at 25% of the value of the futures, the market's not really reacting like there is a surplus. I would say for me the market's balanced. It has an issue, and that issue is simply fixing the Robusta deficit with the Arabica surplus. But I'm very hard pressed to say that there is a global surplus today. And I think people are slowly rationalizing that. They don't like it because it's also happening at the time that demand is soft. But, even if you take down demand numbers, when you look at the prices here for a period of 9 months, I think what is telegraphing here very clearly is that the market at best is balanced, maybe even a small deficit, but certainly not in a surplus, I think.
Debbie?
Thank you for the question. If I understand, there's really two parts to the question. The first one, is there enough coffee today? And the second one is, what does that mean for Brazil? So the first one is, I agree completely with Trishul. We are definitely, and the price tells us this, we are definitely at the end of, or we have definitely had, say, 2 years of deficits, and in coffee deficits. So let's not specify whether that's Arabica or Robusta, but we've had 2 years of deficits. What we see is that still production in the two biggest producers, as I said a bit earlier, Brazil and Vietnam, still underperforms potential. And whilst demand is not fantastic, the production issues, predominantly because of weather, mean that there are still small deficits ahead, in my view. So what does that mean for Brazil? Well, I think Brazil is in the driving seat. And I think Brazil knows it. I think the Brazilian producer really has the liquidity. They have the coffee, both Robusta, Conilons, and Arabica. And I think it is a favorable environment for Brazil. And as we've said, and some of us have said already, we would expect Brazilian production in absolute terms in the medium term, so 2, 3, 4 years to grow, both in absolute terms, but also as a percentage of global production. So it's positive for Brazil.
Absolutely. I can only confirm what you say. In the world of coffee, they say if you want to know what the market's going to do, you have to know what Brazil is going to do. So now more than ever, the market is in the hands of Brazil.
Obrigado.
Happy producers.
Acredito que todos estejam satisfeitos com as respostas. Nós vamos para outro
Yeah,
tema.
but take it easy, okay?
We'll take our check
it easy.
later.
Vamos a outro tema aqui, que é a questão de mercado e finanças, né? Fala-se muito do impacto dos preços do cacau, e já foi dito aqui, Trish, e você havia me pedido anteriormente que citasse aqui e apresentasse um gráfico. Isso é verdade? Qual é a principal mensagem que o mercado do cacau está enviando ao mercado de café? E o que podemos fazer para garantir que não teremos os mesmos problemas? Quer responder, Trish? Fica à vontade.
Trishul's had his cocoa chance already, so I'll have a go. And the first thing to say, if you sell cocoa to someone and then you call them up and say, I'm going to give you coffee instead, that doesn't really help. You have to have a very compliant customer, and I don't have any of those, who will take cocoa against coffee. So really, what this is about is what they call baskets and financial stress. So first thing is typically the speculative community, and indeed the businesses that we are in typically will have cocoa and coffee businesses, cocoa and coffee trading businesses. They are often in the same places. They are tree crops rather than the other grain type crops. So they are often put together. What has happened in cocoa is you've had a major deficit, and as Trishul said, and a very concentrated producer in West Africa, 2 producers, Ivory Coast and Ghana. And there's essentially a systemic risk where it looks like, and others will know more about this than me, it looks like the market was essentially undercapitalized for the type of move that we have seen. So what does it mean for us? I think it's a huge lesson. It's a huge lesson, as Trishul has already said, and I'm sure we'll say some more. It's a huge lesson, and what happens is when you have a concentrated producer or producers in the same parts of the world, and then you have a problem. They have had a weather problem. God forbid we had Brazil say was 50% of global production, which is very possible in the next 5 years, and then there was a major frost or drought, and I think this is the scenario that could play out. So it is a huge lesson to us, and it would certainly be a concern.
Brazil for me is an amazing country, extremely productive, and I think Brazil has been the answer to a lot of the world's problems when it comes to coffee. So in short, for me, thank God for Brazil. As I said earlier in one of my comments, we expect that 70 to 80% of the world's needs of coffee as we go forward over the next 10 years will come from Brazil. This obviously needs to put, I think, a huge smile on the face of the Brazilian producer, because you could say, okay, Brazil is in the driving seat. But I think this is a moment also to think about whether this is good for the world as a whole. And this is what the cocoa market is telling us. We have today Brazil and Vietnam together account for roughly around 55% of the world's production. And when you look at cocoa, Ivory Coast and Ghana account for roughly around 75% of the world's production. If you look at what's happened on the chart, the cocoa manufacturers have been going for the world's cheapest cocoa production. What happened in that sort of situation? Ivory Coast and Ghana thrived. Brazil, who was not actually a very price-efficient producer, reduced cocoa production in that period. So you could argue that the cocoa manufacturer moved to the cheaper source of supply, which was Ivory Coast and Ghana. You fast forward and you look at this, for the last effectively, 20 years or so, we've sort of seen prices in cocoa in a band, let's say, certainly between $2,000 and $3,000. And then there was an issue with the weather in Ivory Coast and Ghana. The moves we've seen here are so extreme that prices basically went from effectively $2,000 to $3,000 to $11,000 in a matter of 6 months. The question is, if you are the producer that's impacted because of a weather event, it's difficult to take full advantage of the price. But more importantly, when you see such a big price move, a number of things begin to happen, which is not good for the industry as a whole. You could end up killing demand permanently if this was to happen in coffee, you could end up killing demand permanently because the consumer just says, okay, enough of coffee. I'm basically going to buy carbonated drinks. I'm going to do something else with my money. It has the capacity for all of the trade to be in deep financial trouble because of the size of the margin calls, and the trade is what is actually keeping the supply chain, sustainability, everything going for the industry. So in my view, a big move like we've seen in cocoa could happen in coffee, and that I don't think is good for anyone in the industry, not the farmer, not the industry, not the trade. So whilst we say thank God, and I say thank God for Brazil, I think we also need to reflect that if the industry pursues the cheapest source of supply, Brazilian farmers very happy, there could come a day we see something very similar happening in coffee as has happened in cocoa. And at that particular point, we're all going to come out of that, I think, in a situation that's significantly worse for all of us, trade participants, the coffee industry that loses demand permanently. And then, of course, when that happens, you could have maybe a scenario where the farmer's happy for a year, and then you see a massive correction. What we've seen in cocoa on one day, sometime in April, the price dropped 20% in a day, which is quite incredible, and that's the kind of volatility we've seen. And I don't think the industry as a whole can cope with that very easily, whether it's the roaster or the trade. So I think what we need to celebrate is the fact that Brazil's here to rescue us in terms of supply. But I also would say very strongly to, I think, the industry as a whole, if you're going to risk mitigate your supply chain, if you pursue only the cheapest source of supply, that it has the consequence eventually to hurt you, and this is the time to think about it. And the Brazilians need to also, I think, acknowledge it's good to be the biggest and the best, but not, you shouldn't aspire to have a situation where all the production comes from Brazil, because that's also not good. Maybe I'm being a bit dramatic in that particular consequence, but the reality is, I don't think any of us want to see what's happened in cocoa.
Definitely. And anything can happen. There's many commodities that have spiked like that. I think before cocoa there was nickel or something like that. Anything can happen. But coffee is different. The main difference, as we say, the farmer in Ghana and the Ivory Coast has not invested much in his plantation because the government keeps a very big percentage of the price. There's not one single farmer that has seen more than $2,000 per ton. So obviously, if they're having that lousy price for so many years, well, nobody invests. The governments of Ghana and Ivory Coast have to be a little bit more generous with their farmers so that they produce more. So that is one big difference. Another big difference is that there was a lot of defaults. Many defaults, We had a customer who said, hey, we need to do projects in the Ivory Coast. And we said, we have 100% default in the Ivory Coast. We can't do projects, because cooperatives don't, it just doesn't work that way. So obviously the spikes is when people have to lift hedges and all that. That can happen in coffee as well, but the supply chain in coffee is a lot more reliable. We won't have those defaults which will prompt us to buy the market like crazy. Well, at least I hope so. But so there are differences between coffee and cocoa. Anything can happen, the availability of certifiable coffee can be reduced, etc., which can lead to a temporary squeeze. But coffee and cocoa is different. I don't want everybody in the room to start dreaming about a triplication of the price of coffee, because it would not be very good. So wake up. It will not triple. Well, who knows? It will not triple. It will not triple.
Podemos acreditar que o risco dessa analogia com o café é um tanto quanto diferente, por conta que o mercado do cacau ele é mais concentrado e o do café é mais diversificado. Podemos dizer isso? Não sei, o que pensa?
Yeah, it is less concentrated than the cocoa market, but the trend is for it to become more concentrated because Brazil has such a competitive advantage on the cost of production. So yes, today does not look anything like the cocoa market, but the trend is one way. I think the other point here is to say, okay, what's the solution? If we as consumers are not going to make that decision, what actually is the solution? The solution is, again, the solution is price. So you have to what the cocoa market is essentially trying to do is to encourage other producers. And so what the coffee market, you would hope, is doing today is encouraging other producers. I think the risk is that the other producers are not reacting as fast as we would expect. But certainly prices today, you would think over time, encourages other Arabica producers and Robusta producers all over the world, ex-Brazil.
I agree with Ben. I mean, I think for me, the trend has been, up there for the last several years. I have spoken about it before. I think it's the interest of the industry and in the interest of the coffee world to have some diversification in coffee production. And it's very worrying when you have a sort of a situation where you're seeing production in Central America actually declining. And at the same point in time, the differentials of all of those countries have collapsed. And you say, why is that the case? It's because people have shifted blends. They've shifted it to Robusta, they've shifted it to Brazil. And I think that's what's worrying me in terms of the long-term nature of our business, that if that continues, we're going to see the concentration. And the only way that this stops happening is, I think, if the industry decides in some way, shape, or form to take a long-term view on risk mitigating the risks in their supply chain. But maybe this is not the moment to think about it because everyone is battling with soft demand. But it's something I think all of us need to worry about.
I agree with both of you.
Easy.
Obrigado. Essa pergunta, em parte, já foi respondida, mas podemos dizer que como é que o ambiente atual aumenta o risco de contrapartida e que pode ser feito por mitigar exposição e falta de comprimento. Vocês já discorreram um pouco, se quiserem acrescentar algo mais, fiquem à vontade.
Only one line is that we are risk managers, and that's our job, basically, to mitigate this risk. And when you deal with, poor farmers, never put them in a position to default. So it's our job to mitigate those risks, but they will always exist.
Yeah, I agree with Teddy. I think the environment that we're finding ourselves today is a little bit different from maybe 10 years ago. The big difference is, obviously when we as traders buy coffee from farmers or intermediaries or suppliers, we are hedging this coffee on the New York or London markets, which involves paying initial margins. And of course, if the prices rally, we pay variation margins. And today we are financing that effectively at much higher interest rates than before. So from that perspective, it's expensive to run the position. is expensive, obviously, from the point of view of, if you have a performance issue. And if you have a performance issue, you also have the added complexity of having to rebuy the coffee and potentially end up shipping it late, and the market's inverted. So in general, for us, our job, like Teddy says, is to risk manage. And when we risk manage, part of our job is to make sure that we are pricing those risks appropriately. And I think today's environment is very different to a few years ago. A few years ago, if you had price at $1,500, low interest rates, and today you have maybe $3,500 and high interest rates, our job is to then basically price it when we sell it. So from that perspective, I think the world has grappled a little bit with how to manage that risk. And I think those of us who have not managed the risk well find ourselves obviously in financial trouble. So, for us to basically do well, we need to be able to manage these risks well. That's our job, and we need to, in some way, shape or form, price it when we are pricing the coffee to clients.
Bem, obrigado. Quer complementar?
The current environment, the issue is volatility. And when there's a lot of volatility, it's like when your car insurer says to you, how likely are you to crash your car? If you're more likely to crash your car, then the price of something is a lot more expensive. So the issue today is volatility. We spend an enormous amount of time with our counterparts, both on the buy and sell side, to understand them, that they understand us. And I think that's really the number one thing here to mitigate default exposure, apart from spreading risk.
Tem outro tema aqui que nos preocupa, e nós vamos falar um pouco sobre a logística. Como que é que a logística brasileira, nós tivemos um painel aqui agora mesmo a respeito de infraestrutura portuária e tudo mais, como pode afetar esse fluxo do café? E particularmente nós temos um outro porto, que é Vitória, que também nós temos uma grande expedição de café, principalmente os robustas. O que vocês pensam deste problema? Fica à vontade.
Okay.
Vai, Ted.
Well, the one who uses the port of Vitoria should maybe give his opinion first, the one who exports the most. But I believe that the Brazilian ports are at capacity, and we cannot take more. And we're going to export more from Brazil. We need to increase the ports, the capacity.
Thank you, Teddy. It's interesting, actually, in a sort of micro example. This is what happens when one country needs to supply the world. There is an issue. There is what we would call a bottleneck in Vitoria, where more coffee wants to be shipped from the port than can be shipped from the port every month, and so it's an issue, and it affects price ultimately. What happens here? We need an upgrade of the ports generally across Brazil, of the capacities. That takes time, but the simple answer is that there is an issue, and it is marginally affecting price.
Yes.
I'd agree with that. As we said earlier in the conversation today, we have this incredible phenomena where both Brazil and Vietnam produce what we would call a secondary Robusta. You have Vietnam at, let's say, the equivalent of 1,000 over the futures, almost 25% over the value of the futures, and Conlons that are trading more than $1,000 cheaper than a Vietnam Robusta. And you say, okay, why is that happening? Part of the reason is the fact that it's complicated for the roaster to switch out of a sustainability program that he has in Vietnam to one in Brazil. Then there's the issue of glyphosate. Then there's the issue of tax. But as one roaster put it to me very eloquently, he says, one of the reasons I can't use more conlons, he says, I cannot roast a contract. I need to roast the coffee. And he doesn't know whether he's going to get the coffee because of the logistics. So what does he do? He basically doesn't buy as much of the conlons as he would like to. So that's not good for the price of conlons against Vietnam. So yes, I think poor logistics, particularly in Victoria, has a negative impact eventually, to a degree, on the price of the Robusta bases in Vietnam. Sorry, in Brazil.
Bom. E aí, Márcio? Isso é com você, né? Bem, nós vamos para o último tema, que é a questão da sustentabilidade e as mudanças climáticas, né? Que não só o Brasil, como o mundo todo estamos vivendo aí. E a primeira pergunta que se faz é: qual é a sua contribuição para os países como o Brasil e o Vietnã possa ajudar a mitigar as alterações climáticas para os produtores rurais? Pode nos sugerir aí alguma ideia?
So we at Louis Dreyfus have a deforestation commitment that actually predates EUDR. So the first thing we are doing generally with our producers all around the world, and that's not just in coffee but in other commodities as well, is to work with them to ensure that they can meet the requirements of the world. We also have a program called the Stronger Coffee Initiative, which has some specific targets around the environment, ag regeneration and carbon. And again, we work very closely. The whole point of the program is to work very closely with the farmers in both of these countries, but also all the other producing countries that we work in.
I think it's similar for us. I mean, we at Volcafé have been running a program called Volcafé Way now for 10 years or more in 10 producing countries, including places like Brazil and Vietnam, across all of Central America, Africa. And the primary focus of what we're doing is we're working with farmers to make them economically independent, educate them in terms of what are drought-resistant varieties, teaching them basically how to improve productivity. And we typically are using model farms where we are collecting then a group of farmers around that model farm so that they learn from each other. And this is something we've done many years before EUDR. I think all of us, we feel pretty passionately about working in the communities where we feel we are earning our livelihood. So from that perspective, it's not just only the farmers, but we also working with the communities. We wouldn't be anything without those communities, and we understand that very, very clearly. So whether it is not just the farmer on the ground and teaching him how to be more productive, but we work very actively in the community as a whole, and we feel that's part of what we need to give back to the coffee farming community. So we're very active in a number of geographies, and we'll continue to do that.
Very well. Our company also is very much involved in many projects together with our customers who work with us. We have agroforestry projects, we have renovation projects, we have cover crops, we have crop diversification into fruits or other commodities. We're also involved in waste management, in composting, in biochar, and plant nutrition. So basically, it's our day-to-day, it's our daily bread. In Ecom, we have more agronomists than traders, and it's for the good of the coffee community, and we're very happy about it.
Obrigado. Nós já estamos caminhando para o final do painel, e como última pergunta desse tema ainda, e aí vem sim, os novos requisitos da Comunidade Europeia irão aumentar o custo para os consumidores europeus? Poderá ter um impacto no consumo da Europa? E o mercado? Será que está preparado e precificando o risco da forma adequada? Fica à vontade, Ted.
Okay.
Fica à vontade.
Very well. Obviously, I am not very happy with these EUDR requirements. I find it to define it as neo-colonialism. I don't know why the Europeans don't fix their own problems before fixing ours, but anyway. Will it have an impact on consumption? Well, there will be a price, you know, even though coffee does not have a real issue with deforestation, so, but just the fact of all the paperwork they are asking for, or that what we don't actually know what they're asking for, so all that will have a price. And is the market prepared? It is not prepared. We try to be prepared. I think Brazil is prepared, but the ones that will suffer the most are the small farmers from Africa, let's say, or, you know, it will not help the small farmer. It will, the large farmers are ready, the small farmers are not ready, and it's very difficult to get all the paperwork on time to comply with EUDR. But we need more details.
I agree with Teddy. I think our friends in Europe are, quick to make rules that they think are good for the world, but the reality is I don't think they have thought through the consequence of the impact on particularly the small farmer. And I don't mean the Brazilian small farmer. Brazil's quite an advanced country when it comes to farming. I mean the African farmer, the Tanzanian, the Ugandan farmer. When you look at I'm just using that as an example, or Papua New Guinea, the complexity of collecting that information is so enormous that it has a significant cost attached to it. And in the end, if the roaster is looking for the cheapest solution, very clearly that's yet another thing that plays in the favor of a big producer like Brazil and harms a small producer in Africa. I don't think we should be very proud about that. I don't think our European colleagues have thought through the impact on those small farmers. So for me, fact that's basically happening, particularly at a time where I think we should be very concerned about keeping the rest of the non-Brazilian world in some form of production and maintaining a certain diversification of production. This is yet another nail in the coffin, if you will, of that small producer. So I don't think we should be very happy about that. We should be very unhappy about something like that. It will basically increase, I think, the price to the European consumer. And I think, the complexity of getting ready for it, my view is I think different companies are taking it at different levels of seriousness. The major trade houses, I think like the ones that are sitting here on the panel, are taking it extremely seriously, given the risks potentially of the fines that we can face. But what's disturbing for us is that there are a number of other suppliers that are not taking it that seriously. And the problem for us is that the suppliers that are not taking it that seriously tend to underprice the risk. And that for me is a very significant concern. The reality at the end of the day is if you're a roaster and you can't distinguish between someone with a strong balance sheet and a weak one, and you want to buy the cheapest price, I think it creates an issue for the market as a whole. So in my mind today, the world is underpricing that risk. And eventually will need to, I think, begin to price the risk properly, and it's not yet doing that at the minute.
I was asked recently whether EUDR is paid for, in fact, by the producer rather than the consumer. And I think it's a very difficult answer because it's a little bit like saying who pays for the export tax in the end, who pays for the change in the freight rate. I think the answer to the first question is in the environment we are today, where stocks are lower than normal, the stress is probably on the consumer, and the consumer ultimately pays for this. And there is a cost. It is expensive for all the reasons that Trishul and Teddy have said already. It is a complicated and expensive process. We have recruited, and we will need to recruit more people to align with the requirements. Do I think it will have an impact on consumption? The risk is it has an impact on the type of consumption, so it favors countries that can easily align with the rules, and it is a disadvantage for some of the smaller producers, maybe in Central America or Africa or Asia. It is to their disadvantage if they are less organized, particularly at a government level or even on the ground. So I think it'll have potentially have that impact. I think the other thing is there is still a fragmentation in our business, in the supply of coffee. In our business, there is still a big FOB trading market. I think it is more difficult to be a trader of coffee on an FOB basis, so buying and selling documents, if you like. I think it is going to be easier to operate in this market if you have a fully integrated supply chain. So I think it is potentially this could mean more consolidation in the supply chain. So is the market prepared? No, absolutely not. I think there is still some denial. I think, and is it pricing the risk appropriately on literal price? Maybe, but I think the more major risks of non-compliance are enormous, and so I don't think it's probably pricing that yet.
Bem, nós também concordamos, né? E haja visto esta cooperativa que hoje dirijo, formada, constituída por pequenos produtores, esse tema é recorrente. E isto, somado a esses estoques que hoje nós estamos enxergando, não que nós não estejamos comprometidos aí a buscar soluções ou encontrar maneiras para adequarmos a EUDE. Mas, como vocês disseram, esse custo é um custo relevante. E os produtores pequenos, menores, que poderiam contribuir, acredito que não só Brasil, como outros países, e outros países, pelo visto, com maiores dificuldades, seria um empecilho muito grande neste momento de mercado. É esta a análise que eu estou aqui fazendo um resumo, é isso mesmo? Pode, Ted.
Yes, I have a question for you. Could you sell me some EUDR compliant coffee for next year?
And at what price?
And we all want it.
I was first.
Now we have a market.
I'm asking the premium.
Olha, eu posso até respondê-la, desde que vocês me participem, né? O prêmio que venha, para mim me adequar e entregar esse café. É essa pergunta que nós precisamos fazer à Europa, né? Não somente os franceses, italianos lá, mas nós também gostaríamos de ter essa resposta, né? E acredito sim, esta cooperativa trabalha nesse sentido, os processos de sustentabilidade, questão de carbono, nós estamos um tanto quanto avançados. Porém, o prêmio, onde fica? E o custo? Aqui se discutiu se fica no consumidor ou no produtor. Eu acredito que seria os dois setores, né? Os dois segmentos. Mas muito peso no produtor. E principalmente em pequenos produtores. Esse é o custo, né? É isto? Respondi, Ted?
Perfecto. Obrigado.
Eu acredito que o tempo nosso está exaurindo, mas dentro do que foi proposto. Olha para vocês verem, né? Então eu quero parabenizá-los, agradecer por essa oportunidade, uma oportunidade única aqui, e a direção do seminário, por estarmos aqui debatendo, para vocês verem um assunto tão relevante como esse. A plateia ficou calada, querendo ver o que vocês poderiam nos dizer. Mas fico satisfeito. O Brasil, eu acho que continua assim e continuará sendo protagonismo do café para o mundo, né? Vamos lá, vamos em frente. Muito obrigado a todos e obrigado pela paciência de nos escutar.